Welcome to part 3 of the Inner Child series, The Mother Wound and the Self You Had to Become. Who did you become to stay connected? The goal is not to analyze roles. The goal is to understand how the mother-child relationship influences identity formation, not through blame, through understanding. Children naturally adapt to preserve connection, especially with mothers, because attachment feels essential for survival. The child asks, "Who do I need to be loved? Who do I need to be to avoid rejection? Who do I need to be to avoid disappointment? Who do I need to be to stay connected?" And those adaptations often follow women into adulthood. Section 1. Connection became more important than authenticity. As children, we don't begin life wondering who we are. We begin life wondering whether we're safe, whether we're loved, whether we belong. And one of the most powerful relationships shaping that experience is the relationship with our mother or primary caregiver. Not because mothers are perfect, not because mothers are always harmful, but because children naturally adapt to maintain connection, especially when connection feels uncertain. A child doesn't consciously decide to change themselves. They simply notice what works. They notice which behaviors receive warmth, which emotions receive attention, which parts of themselves seem welcome, and which parts seem inconvenient. Slowly, often without realizing it, authenticity takes a step backwards. Connection becomes the priority. The question is no longer, "Who am I?" The question becomes, "Who do I need to be?" And many women carry that question well into adulthood. Not because they're pretending, not because they're being dishonest. Because adaptation became normal long before identity had the chance to develop. The tragedy isn't that the child adapted. The tragedy is that she often forgets she did. Section 2. The Self That Was Rewarded. Every child receives messages about who they are allowed to be. Sometimes those messages are spoken. Sometimes they are silent. Sometimes achievement receives attention. Sometimes obedience receives approval. Sometimes caretaking receives praise. Sometimes independence is celebrated, and over time, children begin connecting acceptance with certain versions of themselves. Not intentionally, automatically. The child learns, this version of me feels safer. This version of me receives love. This version of me creates less tension. The difficulty comes when those adaptations become identity. Because eventually, many women reach adulthood and realize something uncomfortable. They know how to perform. They know how to achieve. They know how to support. They know how to succeed. But they aren't entirely sure who they are underneath those things. Not because there is something wrong with them, because they spent years developing the self that was rewarded, while other parts quietly disappeared into the background. Healing often begins with a simple but powerful question. Which parts of me were welcomed, and which parts of me learned to stay hidden? Section 3. Who were you allowed to be? One of the deepest consequences of childhood conditioning is not necessarily low self-esteem. It's uncertainty. Many women spend years asking, "Why don't I know what I want? Why is it so difficult to make decisions? Why do I second-guess myself? Why do I keep looking to other people for answers?" The answer is often not a lack of confidence, it's a lack of familiarity. Because self-discovery requires space, curiosity, exploration, mistakes, experimentation, the freedom to discover who you are. But many daughters become experts at reading the room before they ever learn to read themselves. They learn how to monitor expectations, predict reactions, manage emotions, avoid disappointment, and eventually they become highly connected to everyone else's experience. while remaining disconnected from their own. This creates a difficult question in adulthood. Not, who was I, but, who was I allowed to be? And sometimes the answer reveals just how much of life was spent adapting instead of discovering. Section 4. The fear of disappointing others. Many women spend years believing they have a problem with boundaries. But often the real issue isn't boundaries, it's disappointment. Because somewhere along the way, disappointing people stopped feeling uncomfortable and started feeling unsafe. You may notice it when someone is upset with you, disagrees with you, pulls away from you, seems disappointed in you. The emotional reaction often feels bigger than the situation itself. Not because you're weak, not because you're overly sensitive, because the younger part of you learned something important. Connection feels secure when other people are happy. Connection feels uncertain when other people are disappointed. And so adulthood becomes a constant balancing act. Trying not to upset anyone, trying not to create conflict, trying not to let people down, trying not to be misunderstood. The problem is that eventually, you begin sacrificing yourself to avoid disappointing others. You say yes when you mean no. You stay when you want to leave. You explain when you don't owe an explanation. You overextend yourself because someone else's discomfort feels heavier than your own. And after years of doing this, something begins to happen. You stop asking, "What do I need?" and start asking, "What will keep everyone else happy?" That isn't authenticity. That's survival, and many women never realize how much of their identity has been built around preventing disappointment. Section 5. Separating identity from adaptation. One of the most difficult parts of healing is recognizing that some things you've called personality may actually be adaptation. Not all of them, but some. The need to be useful, the need to be needed, the need to be perfect, the need to keep the peace, the need to prove your worth, the need to earn rest, the need to explain yourself, the need to constantly justify your existence. Many women assume, this is just who I am, but healing invites a different question. Is this who I am, or is this what helped me stay connected? Because there is a difference, a huge difference. Adaptations are not failures. They were intelligent responses to the environment. They helped you survive. They helped you belong. They helped you make sense of experiences that felt confusing. The goal is not to judge them. The goal is to recognize them. Because once you can see the adaptation, you can begin choosing whether it still belongs in your life. And that is where identity reconstruction begins, not by creating a new self, but by removing what was never truly you. As we come to the end of this episode, I want to leave you a few questions. Not one to answer immediately, just one to sit with. If nobody needed anything from you, who would you be? If nobody expected anything from you, who would you be? If your worth wasn't measured by what you provide, fix, carry, manage, solve, achieve, or sacrifice, who would you be? For many women, that question feels uncomfortable, not because the answer doesn't exist, but because it hasn't been explored. And that is what healing eventually becomes. Reconnecting with the person underneath the adaptation, the person underneath the performance, the person underneath survival. In our next episode, we're going to explore something that many women misunderstand. Reparenting, not as self-care, not as positive thinking, but as the process of giving yourself the emotional experiences that may have been missing in the first place. because understanding your story is important. If today's episode raised questions about who you really are beneath the adaptation, make sure you're subscribed for part 4. Because awareness helps us understand what happened. But healing begins when we start giving ourselves the emotional experiences we may never have received in the first place.